Hi everybody, I'm Suzanne Feldman. I'm the author of Sisters of the Great War, which you may have read. I have a new book coming out this fall. It's called The Witch Bottle and Other Stories. It's a collection of short stories that I wrote. And it won a prize, and I'm very proud of it, and I love the cover. I hope you do too. I'm here to show you how to make these two lovely loaves of bread, challah. This video is entitled "The Best Challah Bread You've Ever Tasted," and or challah for challah. And we will get started. I'll show you what to do. All you need is these very few ingredients: flour, honey, yeast, salt, some oil, and of course eggs, because this is a honey egg bread. Okay, so this is my recipe, which I have no idea where I got it. I would like to tell you that my grandmother gave this to me, but she didn't. I got it from somewhere else, and this is a recipe that you can actually find in The Joy of Cooking that I did not know at the time that I got this recipe. First thing we're going to do is we're going to proof the yeast. If you're an experienced bread maker, you know how to do this. What we're going to do is we're going to put a cup of hot water in here. The water has to be between 100 and 110 degrees. And we're going to check it with this digital thermometer. But before we do that, what we're going to do is we're going to put the yeast in the bottom of here with a little bit of sugar. So a teaspoon of sugar, because yeast needs to be fed. In it goes. The yeast, and this recipe calls for 2 packages of yeast. So since we need 2 packages of yeast, we're going to do 4 teaspoons, 4.5 teaspoons. Where's my half? There we go. So I use active dry yeast. You can use really any kind of yeast you like. I've never been able to find fresh yeast, but I don't live in a place where there is fresh yeast, so I just use the dry. I'll put that in there. And then we will stir this up so the yeast and the sugar are integrated. And then what we're going to do is we're going to take the other measuring cup and run hot water into it until the water is between 100 and 110. So it's too hot now. And I've tried doing this with, microwaving the water, but it's so hard to control that way. Okay, let's see. First of all, we need to make sure it is exactly a cup, because this recipe calls for exactly a cup of water. That looks good. That is 109 exactly. And I'm going to pour in the water into the yeast and sugar like that. I'm going to give it a little stir so the yeast and the sugar dissolve. Like that. You want to make sure you get it all off the edges of the cup. And you'll see that like little grains of yeast are still left on the fork. That's probably okay. We'll just put that in there. And we'll wait 5 minutes. Let me set my timer. I will now introduce you to my mixer. This is, I used to have a KitchenAid, and then a friend of mine got one of these. This is called an Ankeshroom. We call it the Antigone, because we can't really always pronounce Ankeshroom. I saw a video where a chef who was a baker, he had his KitchenAid and his Ankeshroom side by side. And this is what really convinced me to get this thing, because it's not cheap. The KitchenAid, it has the 2 bladed mixers, things. And what it did, and what he pointed out, was that it tears the dough. And I often had problems getting the dough to rise, and it didn't work out as well as it does with this. With this kind of mixer, which is a planetary action apparently, where the bowl spins, but and this just spins with the action of the bowl. You put the wet ingredients in first, so we want 3 eggs at room temperature. And the reason they're at room temperature, if you're an experienced baker, you know this, is because we don't want to kill the yeast with cold. Yeast has to be fed, it has to be coddled, it has to be made special in its use. And so that's what we do. Now I'm going to take 1/3 cup for the following ingredients. One is sugar, just plain old white sugar, like that. Nice flat cup, or 1/3 cup. In it goes. This is the only one of the ingredients that is not wet that goes in first. Then we're going to put in some oil, just regular basic vegetable oil, and that goes in next. And it's important that you stick to this order, and I'll show you why. In goes the oil. Because, and look at the yeast, look how it's marching. It's getting ready to be like completely activated. If it doesn't do this, you know and this is why I proof the yeast, because I need to know if it's alive. And the yeast, if you do it like this outside the bread before you actually start putting it in there, it's not a big guessing game as to whether or not your bread is going to accomplish anything. So if the yeast is alive, this is what it should look like. It'll get even bigger in the next couple of minutes. And it's the last of the wet ingredients that goes into the mixer. So you've got 1/3 cup of sugar, 1/3 cup of oil, and now we're going to put in 1/3 cup of honey, and I'll show you why the oil is important to be put in before the honey. Because once the honey goes in, as we know, honey is sticky. And hard to see in a metal container. Okay, we'll just take that off. And once you have the honey in the oiled container like this, the oil is a release for the honey, and it just slides off. Everything looks good, although it doesn't look like bread yet. And that's all you need the cups for. So here you can see the yeast has gotten even bigger in the last just minute and a half, 2 minutes. And it's now at the 2-cup mark of a 2-cup Pyrex cup. So this is the last of the wet ingredients going into the bread. And in it goes, just like that. We want to get all of the foamy goodness into the dough so that we have enough for this to rise through basically what's going to be 5 cups of flour. All good. Now we are ready for the dry ingredients. All the wet ingredients are in there. You don't even have to mix them before you put in the dry stuff. And now the only things that are not in here are the salt and the flour. It's real important that you not put the salt in on top of the yeast, because it will kill the yeast, and you don't want dead yeast, and all of this is for naught. So we're going to put, let's see, how many teaspoons? 2 teaspoons of salt. Okay, the flour. So I use this brand. This brand has a hotline. When you call the hotline, they tell you why your bread won't rise. I have a lot of respect for them. So I'm going to get a cup, and I'm going to put 5 cups of flour into this bowl. Some people are now cringing because I am not sifting my flour. I honestly have never sifted flour for baking bread. I don't think you need to. So this is enough for 2 loaves of fabulous challah. There we go. And this is where I'm going to put the salt in. And the teaspoon and the salt. I always do this over the sink instead of over the flour because God knows what could happen. That looks good. 1, and just checking again to make sure it's 2. And it is. Okay. So the angstrom now is on. It's on a low speed. I'm going to speed it up a little bit so that the eggs beat. One thing about this is you can move this around. It's really cool. I'm going to turn it down a little bit. Add the flour gradually, a little at a time. It has a little blade here that keeps it against, keeps the dough from gathering there. A little bit there. Move it around. I'm going to speed it up. That looks about right. I'm going to add another cup of flour. A little bit at a time. Let it mix. You can see it's just a slurry right now, but it's going to solidify and be fabulous. And it's the same with a KitchenAid, or if you're doing this by hand. You just add a little at a time, a little at a time. We want to make sure that island of flour goes away. There it goes. A little bit more. It's starting to become a beautiful dough, very smooth. And what you're looking for is a smooth, elastic dough that is a bit shaggy. You don't want to over knead it. You just want, and I'm going to show you when the dough comes together and becomes not slurry, but more of a shaggy mass, and it's getting there. So in we go, a little bit more flour, and you can see it's starting to form up. Yeah, that's what we want. And the secret with bread really is, like I said, it's time and temperature. You have to give it time. You have to make sure everything is the right temperature. If it's not, things won't happen. And then really the worst thing that can happen with bread is that it just doesn't happen. So it's really a fairly simple process. And here's where the bread starts to be bread. You can see it's starting to form a shaggy mass. And probably, well, let's just see here. I'm going to take it off the blade. Make sure that's clean. That's good. And then I think this may be the last cup of flour. We'll see. There it goes. You really don't want to overdo it. And we're going to feel the dough in a minute to find out if it's the right stickiness or non-stickiness. And then we're going to let it just knead. But right now it looks too sticky to me, so I'm going to put in some more flour. And there we go. And I'm going to turn the speed up a little bit so that it can just mix. Now I'm going to turn it off for just a second and see how sticky the dough is. Too sticky, way too sticky. So we will just turn it back on. Usually it takes 5 to 6 cups of flour. This is clearly going to take at least 5. And you can see it's just forming up a little bit more. It's also being kneaded by the machine, so it's coming around really well. All right, I'm going to turn it up again and just see how sticky it is, because I think I need to add a little bit more. Still kind of sticky. Okay, it's not going to need much. Yeah. right. I'm going to put a tad bit more in there so it releases from the bottom. There we go. Now what's going to happen is the machine is going to knead the dough. We're going to set it for about 8 minutes. Let me just wash my hands. And the dough is looking good, it feels good. So while the machine is kneading, I'm going to warm up the microwave. And I'm going to show you what that's all about. About a half a cup of water. It doesn't matter what temperature it is. And we're going to put this in the microwave because that is where the bread is going to rise. I'm going to set this for 3 minutes and let it run and hope no fuses blow. And while that's happening, this is on autopilot. It looks really good. I'm going to take some spray canola, and really don't use anything flavored for these breads because it's got plenty of flavor. We're going to spray the inside. So the dough is going to go in here, and that's so it comes out without any trouble. And I don't remember if I mentioned this before, but this is about a 4-hour process with lots of sort of, free time once you get the bread in the bowl and the microwave taken care of. All right, I'm going to stop this. I'm going to get it off the rotor. But look how elastic and beautiful that is looking. Yeah. Okay. So the dough is now much more formed. You can see it's not as sticky. It's not really sticking to my fingers very much. It's elastic. You can see that. And I'm just going to give it a few more minutes of kneading. It needs about, I'm going to say another 4. And while it's doing that, the microwave is heating up. And this is kneading, so it's all taking care of itself. All right, the timer's just gone off. Now we're going to do the next thing. So the next thing is to get the dough into this greased bowl. Make sure it's greased, otherwise your dough will never come out and all this will be for naught. I'm gonna peel this off the rotor, but it's very elastic and it looks great. And this is where you have to have some muscles because getting it out of the bowl is kind of a challenge sometimes because it's, it is not as sticky as it used to be, but it is still fairly sticky. You want to get as much dough back in there as you can. Put it in there. Take this out. Peel off some of that. Because you want to have as much dough as possible. Okay. And now I'm going to just get this in here. I don't know if you can see this, but it's just, dough is slowly releasing. It's just a little wad of its former self. It's amazing to think that there are 5 cups of flour in here and that this is going to be 2 loaves of bread. But that is the magic of baking. Okay, now, so you need to roll it over so that the top and sides are covered with oil from the greased pan. You can see that, it's not harmed by your touching it or anything like that. So as you may recall, we have a half cup of water in there. that's been boiling for 3 minutes. And what we're doing is we're creating a warm, moist environment for the yeast so that it can grow into bread. I used to do this technique in my oven, but my oven only goes down to 145 degrees. So the bread would billow up and then it would flatten when I baked it. And so I called the hotline and they said, use your microwave in this manner. So I have ever since. And here comes the hot water because that is not something we need in there right now. And then in goes the dough. A lot of people will tell you to cover your dough. I have never done that. The idea is that, if you don't want it to stick to the top of, the inside of the microwave, of course, but it's not, I don't think it's going to get that big. In it goes real quick. Feels warm and steamy in there. I'm going to set my kitchen timer for half an hour. So no power, just time. And so we're probably going to do this 3 times. Oops. And then we'll do the second rise, which I'll show you how to do. All bread goes through 2 rises. Well, not all bread, but most bread goes through 2 rises. So the first rise is from the wad of dough into the big billowy pillow of dough. And the second rise is going to be after we form it into loaves, put it in the loaf pans, and then the loaf pans will go back in there. Okay, so it's been half an hour. You can tell because it says end. And we're going to open this up. We're going to look at the dough, which is marginally bigger and feels a little bit warm. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to push my fingers into it a tiny bit to see, just basically to show you what happens when it rises. So I don't know if you can really see it, but where I've pushed my fingers in, a dent remains. And that means the dough is not ready, even though it's bigger. We want it to be more or less double in size. So to do that, like I said, it's all about babysitting. We're going to put the water back in there for 3 minutes, let it boil. And the dough is fine out here. And I've actually found that I used to put a plate over it because I was like, oh, gotta cover the dough while it's rising. But I found that in the microwave, because it's so enclosed, if you put a plate on top, it actually keeps it from rising because it holds the cooler air in and the moist, hot air never gets to it. So we'll give this a couple minutes to boil, and always be sure that you use hot pads to get that out of there because you will hurt yourself. It is very, 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 very hot. So I used to do this in the oven, and like I said, the bread would overproof, and it would get it would become this giant pillow. And then when I tried to do the egg wash on it, the bristles of the brush would pierce the dough microscopically, and it would just deflate, and it was just like, what am I doing wrong? I don't know. And it was that I was overproofing. Right, yes. So if you have a proofing drawer in your oven, lucky you, like the Great British Baking Show. And of course, if you do watch that, you know all about Bread Week, which inspires me mightily to make amazing things. But you can always start small, with the best challah loaf you've ever eaten. 4, 3, 2, 1. All right. So now we're going to carefully open this. Everything is very hot. And we want to keep as much of that hot air and moisture in there as possible without hurting ourselves. And now the dough goes back in really quickly for kitchen timer, 30 more minutes. And we'll probably do this a couple more times. Check that out. Now it's almost doubled in size. It might actually be doubled in size. We're going to find out by putting our fingers in and seeing if it comes back out. I think it needs a little more time because the dents are staying in. One more time for the half cup of water. In it goes. 3 minutes, high power. And by the end of the next half hour, we'll have dough up to here. It'll be like amazing. It'll be like this big pillow of dough. Yeah. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. And again, making sure that as little heat gets out of that microwave as possible. Not touching the hot, hot glass. In goes the dough for another half hour. Okay, so now what we're going to do is we're going to butter and flour the loaf pans. You can use a non-stick loaf pan, but you still have to butter it and flour it. So I'm just going to take this butter, which has been sitting out for hours and is nice and soft. I'm going to make sure I get into the corners, because that's where the trouble usually occurs. Making sure you get into all those corners with your release, right? Because this is a release for the bread. Make sure that the bottom is covered with butter. If you're an experienced baker, you might want to use something else like Crisco, but I've found that butter really works, and it also it works better than Crisco, and it also imparts a nice flavor to the bread. It's you're going to put butter on it anyway. If you're not an experienced baker, don't be like intimidated by bread. Bread is so, I don't know, it's very therapeutic, I find. It's almost like a meditation on cooking, and it requires patience and attention and babysitting, so it's almost like a living thing as you make it, and it is really a living thing because the yeast is alive. But the yeast is going to have, the yeast is ultimately going to die in the oven when we cook this bread. So it is a heroic, heroic job that the yeast does. So this is where we're going to use the little bit of flour that we have left. We're going to tap that in there, and we're going to knock that around until we get a really good butter and flour kind of coating for the metal. I do it like this so that the flour falls into the other pan as we work. And that looks pretty good. We'll knock out any extra. There. Just give it a good whack. Okay? That's where that's left to, and we're going to take this flour and put it on the cutting board and spread it out. This is where the dough is going to go in the next step. We're going to lay the dough out, we're going to punch it down, not in a violent way, but in a loving way. And we're going to braid it into 3 parts, and that is the next step. So as you can see, we have about 10 minutes left to go, but at this point, from my experience, what we'll have is the dough ready to come out. So we're going to open this and see the results. And it's enormous. Look how huge that is. Wow, it's like a pillow of dough, which is what it's supposed to be.
Very good.
So we'll take it out, and it feels nice and warm. We'll give it the poke test, and it just pops right back. So if I put my fingers in like that, it pops back. You can see where I put my fingers in before. It's not popping back, but it just pops right up. And that's because it's full of air. So what we're going to do now is we're going to dump it into the flour. Put that over here. And we're going to roll it a little bit so I get some flour into it. We're going to squeeze out the air, because that is what the yeast is for at this point. We're going to basically take the air out so the yeast can do its final ballet before it's cooked. And we're going to make it into a long coil like this, because it's going to be braided and it has to be ropey. Squeeze out the air, make it into a coil, into a long ropey dough here. There really is nothing you can do to hurt the dough at this point. It's really kind of invulnerable to your abuse, and it's, you have to kind of really be firm with it, firm but fair. We're going to cut it up into 3 parts, just like the last one. And we're going to squish the ends together a little bit here. As you can see, these are not really equal, and that's okay. It gives the loaf personality when it comes out of the oven. So we're going to braid, over, braid, braid, braid. We're going to tuck that end like that. And then on this end, we're going to stretch it out a little bit and under braid like this. Tuck that and put it into the pan. And now the final rise. It'll take half an hour to 45 minutes. At this point, the yeast is very eager to get it over with. Okay. We will now carefully take out the boiling water. It's nice and hot in there. Put that there. Get the loaf pans in one at a time real quick. Real quick. In you go. Without breaking anything. Kitchen timer, 30 minutes. Good. It's always such a relief when the microwave does not go on when I do that. What we're going to do now is make the egg wash. And we're going to crack the egg into this little container. Out you come, egg. Whoops, I got shell in there. I'm an amateur. Come on out, shell. Okay. And then we need a tablespoon of water, which I'm going to have to do like this. Just a tablespoon. In it goes. And we're going to mix this up. If you don't put in the tablespoon of water, it's just too thick. The egg should be, all the eggs should be room temperature, but this one's been sitting out for hours, and it is definitely, they just have a different consistency when they're at room temperature. That looks good. And this is a very cheap brush I got from Amazon. I used to use a barbecue brush for my bread, but it pierced the dough, and that was not good. But this is very gentle. It's like painting a picture, which I will be demonstrating shortly. So we've got about 6 minutes to go on this rise. I set the timer for 20 minutes, and I'm going to look at it now because I think the bread is ready. Let's have a look. It is beautiful. Oh my God. That's ready to go in the oven. I'm not even going to test it because I know it should look like this. And but I mean, you can poke a little bit like that, just lightly, and you'll see the dough spring back. So now is the egg wash, which I'm going to mix up one more time just to make sure. Put that in there, and then with my beautiful brush, I'm going to paint the bread with egg. And this gives it a beautiful golden finish. It's what makes challah look like challah. If you don't do this, you get kind of a dull looking loaf. Like the color isn't quite right, but this makes it golden and beautiful and irresistible. You want to get into all the little corners that are created by the braid, and you want to make sure that the egg isn't, this is actually very important. You want to make sure that the egg is not running down the sides of the bread. You don't want to put that much on, because the egg will then cook to the side of the loaf pan, and when you try to take the bread out, the bread will stick, and you'll have like this chunk of bread left in the loaf pan, and you don't want that. You know, the great thing about challah is that it's so homemade, it's so handmade. You can get this, you know, in stores, of course, in grocery stores, but it is not the same. And you know, if this lasts long enough, challah makes some of the best French toasts that you can make if you let it, if you know, no one is eating it madly when you get it out of the oven, and you can let it get stale a little bit. It makes fabulous French toast. It's just very different from any other bread. You can see there's a little egg white on there still. I'm just gonna work that in. and make sure I got all the surfaces. And that looks right. Okay, now the bread is going into a 350-degree oven. In it goes. And in it goes. Like that. At 25 minutes, which what I've set the timer for, I'm gonna look at the bread and thump it. And if it sounds hollow, it's done. If it sounds dense and like a brick, it's not. But it's gonna be pretty obvious. It's gonna rise some more. The yeast, it's doing its swan song, and it's gonna be amazing. So we're gonna open it up and have a look. We're gonna do some thumping. That bread looks good, but it needs to be a little bit more caramel colored. Also, it sounds a little solid, which means it's not quite done. This sounds good, but that doesn't. So I'm gonna put that back in and give it another 5. So now the great reveal. It looks really good. Looks a little darker than it did last time. Thumping. Sounds hollow. Sounds good. And that's just something that you learn how to do as you do the bread. So you can see how the yeast has done its final rise in the oven and has made the braid real tight and has made the surface of the bread look really beautiful. That egg wash makes everything golden and it's just gorgeous. So now it's going to sit in the pan for about 5 minutes. Really no longer than that because you don't want the bread to be condensing in there. So I'm setting my timer for 5, letting it run. I'm going to put these on a not hot surface so they can cool slightly. And we'll just let them sit for a little while. Okay, are we ready to decant? I'm ready to decant. Okay. We're going to take the bread out of its pans. You want to make sure that the egg is not binding the bread to the pan. And I don't feel it. I don't think it is. So that's real good. And you can see the loaf is loose. So that's cool. And now we're going to flip it out of the pan, which is still super hot. So be careful. Shake it a little bit. Out it comes. And then we're going to flip it back over because the bread is hot. You got to be gentle with it because it really is only tied together. And that looks awesome. And now we're going to take it out of the pan, flip it over, give it a little shake. It looks good. You can see the egg kind of came in through the inside. That's what the staining is here, but that's not a big deal, nor is it a flaw. And now we're going to let it sit for 10 minutes. And then we're going to eat it. We're going to eat that bread. So here's the bread. It is beautiful. It smells amazing. Some fabulous raspberry preserves.
All right.
Allow me. This bread can be frozen. I usually cut it in half and freeze half of it and eat the other half. And that way the whole loaf remains fresh. It is so good looking. It's almost a crime to put jam on it, but it's not a big enough crime to stop. Alrighty then. Well, cheers.
Cheers.
L'chaim
Thank
to
you.
You're so welcome. Let's have some bread.
Yeah.